Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the annual Beckman-Brown Lecture on Interdisciplinary Science. It's certainly great to have a nice crowd showing up. I think a few more will be trickling in over the next few minutes. The lecture honors the late Arnold Beckman, the founder of the Beckman Foundation. And also we have with us Dr. Ted Brown, who's the founding director of the Beckman Institute. The Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation endowed this lecture series, and we're certainly grateful to be able to bring together a wide audience on topics of great interest to just about everyone. So thanks for joining us. Before I introduce today's speaker, however, Ted Brown is here and he is going to offer us a few words. So Ted, if you would be so kind as to take over, thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad that we're back in action with the lecture series after a hiatus of 1 year. You've already mentioned the fact that the Beckman Foundation is endowed the annual lectureship. I'd like to also point out that that endowment also includes funds for a postdoctoral fellowship. And we have a new postdoctoral fellow coming to join the Beckman Institute in the next month or so. Her name is Jean Ndaya, and she's coming to us from the University of Toronto, where she's earning her PhD in material science. So we're grateful to the foundation for the support that they've given us. Now, what has made the Beckman Institute a great success is not merely the fact that it has a very large building and it's a beautifully designed facility. It took something more. And the mustering of, that was really the mustering of human capital in new configurations. It required major change in the relationships, in the organizational and social structure that have rippled across this entire campus since the Beckman Institute began. The relationships between departments, colleges, and administration, and most importantly, in terms of faculty members, commitments and understandings of commitments to collaborations that cut across interdisciplinary lines, divides. In short, by the way, it turns out to be mostly about designing, building, and sustaining networks. And as our current director, Jeff, knows, it's a continuing challenge. The Beckman Institute is an organic thing. It requires continual work and development. I look forward to what Dr. Christakis is going to tell us today about a subject that really is at our very core. And so it's an honor to turn over the introduction back to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Ted, thanks so much. It's really great that you can be here. I think the vision that you all had is really living out today and will continue to live out. It's really to your credit that I think exactly as you spoke of, that Beckman's a place where people who value teams and networks above themselves come together to do their research. And it's because of that mindset that I think we're able to do things that we could never do as individuals. And along those lines, then I'm really pleased to introduce today's Beckman-Brown lecturer, Professor Dr. Nicholas Christakis, who's here to talk about the blueprint of that idea. It's his title of his book, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. So because of this tight connection to how we operate at Beckman, I'm really eager to hear from Nicholas and try to relate this in actionable ways to the things that we do here at the Beckman Institute. Dr. Christakis, MD, PhD, MPH, is the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University. His work is in the field of network science, bioscience, and the convergence of behavioral genetics. He directs the Human Nature Lab and is the co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. He was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2006, the American Association for the Advancement of Science as a fellow in 2010, and most recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2017. Nicholas, thanks so much for being here. We're really delighted, and we know that the message you'll deliver will really hit home to all of us on the line today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to your words. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you. It was nice to see that Ted is here too, and thank you all for your for participating. Can you, first of all, easily see me, and can you see the slides still?
Nicholas, everything looks perfect. Thanks.
Great. Okay. So, so for too long, in my view, the scientific community has been focused on the dark side of our nature, of our evolutionary heritage, on our capacity for selfishness and mendacity and tribalism and cruelty and violence. And I think that the bright side has been denied the attention that it deserves, because our species also evolved to be good and to manifest wonderful qualities like love and friendship and cooperation and teaching. And these good qualities must necessarily have outweighed the bad qualities, or we wouldn't be living socially in the first place. We'd live in a solitary fashion like other animals. If every time, like many other animals, like if every time I came near you, you were lied to me, gave me misinformation about the world, or were mean to me, or were violent towards me, or killed me, I'd be better off living apart. So the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs. And in fact, our species has evolved to make a very particular kind of good society, I would argue. And we evolved, in other words, not only to live in groups, but rather to live in a very particular way, equipped with a very particular set of innate capacities. We are not simply like a group of zebras or crocodiles or ants massing together. We live socially in a very distinctive way. And we manifest this social ability very early in life. Many have argued, for instance, that one of the primary functions of play in childhood is simply to prepare us for living together. Now, what kind of evidence could we use to ascertain the kind of social order that comes naturally to us and that we are, let's say, universally predisposed to make? If you were a mad scientist trying to experimentally explore this topic, what you might want to do is to take a group of babies who had never been taught anything and somehow, abandon them on some isolated island somewhere, and then somehow contrive for them to be raised and fed and not killed and grow up, and then observe what kind of social order did they make for themselves? How did those people, babies now grown up to be adults, interact socially and organize themselves socially, absent any kind of cultural learning? How might they have been prepared for an innate sociality? And in other words, you could think about this like birds innately programmed to sing a particular song, no matter what the circumstances. Now, of course, it's impossible to do this. It's cruel and unethical. And in fact, this experiment that I'm imagining has been called the forbidden experiment. But this hasn't stopped powerful rulers for thousands of years of contemplating this experiment. Here are a few monarchs going back to Psamtik I, 2,600 years ago. And many of these monarchs, in fact, were motivated by the question, what kind of language comes innately to us? In other words, if we weren't taught to speak, what language would we speak? And many of these monarchs contrived to have, for example, a couple of babies given to a shepherd, a mute shepherd up in the mountain, to be raised to see what language did these babies come to speak for themselves. Now, obviously, we cannot do this kind of experiment that I have, this hypothetical experiment that I've imagined. So what might be some proxies for such an experiment? Well, there are a number of possibilities with respect to natural experiments. For instance, consider the idea of shipwrecks, where people are unintentionally thrown together and are left to remake society anew. So in one line of inquiry, that's part of the book Blueprint that I think was mentioned early on, I was able to identify 9,000 shipwrecks that occurred between 1500 and 1900. And I was able to identify 20 of them where the castaways numbered more than 19 people and where they were stranded for more than 2 months. And they're shown here on this map. And I studied in detail what sort of social order they made for themselves, looking at all available written accounts and all archaeological excavations of the wreck sites, and so on. And one particularly powerful pair of cases involved two crews stranded on the opposite ends of an island that's north of Antarctica and south of New Zealand, who were shipwrecked at the same time in 1864, though they were unaware of each other's fate. One crew, the Grafton, shipwrecked on the southern part of the island in that inlet that's shown there, and 5 men made it to shore and survived for about 2 years, and all of them made it off. And on the northern part of the island in the same year, 19 men made it to shore on the Ingroup, and all but 3 of them died. And you can actually, in the same year, on the same island, 2 different crews wrecking, you can ask yourself the question, well, what might explain the difference between the outcomes? There's a lot actually in those stories. They're amazing stories to read. But I'll just summarize a couple of details. When the Grafton struck rock on the southern part of the island, the captain was in his cabin and had a fever. And the ship was sinking. 4 of the 5 men made it ashore, and they decided that they were going to go back and rescue the captain. And they set up a rope line between the sinking boat and the shore and brought the captain ashore. And all 5 of them went on to survive the whole ordeal and engaged in a number of practices. For example, they set up a school for themselves to teach each other things. And they did this deliberately so that they wouldn't have too hierarchical a social order. They took turns being the teacher of the others, each one teaching something else, something different. The Ingroup, when they wrecked, there were 19 men, 1 man gets ashore injured, and they're at the bottom of this cliff, and the other 18 men climb the cliff, and they abandon that man to die. And over the course of the time that they were on the island, they ultimately resorted to cannibalism. They had a kind of every man for himself kind of attitude. So one wreck begins with an altruistic cooperative act. One wreck begins with the opposite, and there are different fates after that different kind of social order for these wrecks. Now, of course, it wasn't very pleasant being a subject of these experiments, of these natural experiments. As you can see, being dragged through the cold. Still, the crew of the Grafton was able to build a dwelling and work together and survive for 2 years before they made it off the island. This is the drawing from their 150-year-old account published about 150 years ago by by the captain of the boat. And I also looked at intentional communities, such as 19th century communes, where people deliberately set out to remake society, possibly in a new way. We have written accounts of this going back thousands of years. During Roman times, there were people that said, society is all messed up. Let's go and make our own society in a different way. And we have had communitarian movements around the world that we have accounts of for thousands of years. And in the United States, we have a very rich history of communitarian movements. For example, this is the Brook Farm commune in Massachusetts, or the Shakers, or other communitarian movements in the United States. Or 20th century communes too, I was able to analyze, or kibbutzes in Israel, or still other kinds of groups of people isolating themselves to live together in intentional communities. For example, scientists in Antarctica. Since the 1950s, we've maintained research facilities on the South Pole, and groups of people winter over for the whole winter, for 10 months, are isolated from the rest of the world. How do they organize themselves socially? Or at online worlds. So you can look at online worlds where in theory, people could organize themselves any way they want without any kinds of restraint. Or still other examples like nuclear subcrews, or Latin American prisons, or miners stranded deep beneath the earth, and communities formed by displaced persons in the wake of natural disasters, where large groups of people relocate and have to figure out how to organize themselves. And finally, in experiments that I've done in my lab, we've invented a software that allows us to, in a godlike way, create temporary artificial societies of real people, where we can engineer the social interactions between people, or the amount of information they have, or how they interact with each other. We can control it in some way, and then explore the experience of the people and of the groups using this software, which we've made publicly available. And over 30,000 people have come to our online lab and participated in our experiments in the last 10 years, allowing us to probe the deep underpinnings of social order. And what I found is that there was some deep and fundamental principles that constrain us to only one way of being social. And I'd like to illustrate this by reference to a very famous example of the world of all possible shells. In the 1960s, a paleontologist at the University of Chicago by the name of David Raup became fascinated by shell morphology and with whether it was possible to unify the world of shells in a single equation. And he devised the following way of thinking about it: arrange shells in a three-dimensional space that he called a morphospace. So imagine three axes, each axis of which describes some feature of the cells. For example, distance, which is the y-axis on the far right. This is, the y-axis here, the distance. This is the distance of the curve of the shell from the axis. You can think about it like a coil of stamps. Is it a tightly wound coil, or is it a more and more loosely wound coil? That's distance. Translation rate here on the x-axis which is here, is like a slinky. So here you can think about a spring. Is it compact this way, the spring, or is it loose, lifted up like a slinky? And finally, he had the expansion rate, which was the rate at which the aperture in which the animal lived expanded. Was it like a cylindrical a cavity? So as you walked through the shell, if you were a tiny little animal and you walked through the shell, did the diameter stay the same, or did it get narrower and narrower as you went further back? And at what rate did it become narrower? And he took these three simple parameters, and then he populated this three-dimensional space with all shells that had ever existed, current shells and paleontological shells. And he found that actually only a tiny fraction of this morphospace, shown here in gray, was occupied. Even though in theory there were so many ways you could have a shell, in practice very few ways were ever realized. And so we can think about, even though there are many types of shells that are theoretically conceivable, most will nonetheless never have come into existence. Well, we could imagine defining some axes for societies, like how friendly they are, or how cooperative they are, or how unequal they are, or how hierarchical they are. And then we could plot all observed societies along those axes in a 3, 4, 5, 6-dimensional space, and then ask how many societies do we find spread out over this morphospace. And we would find once again that even though there's a huge theoretical possible range of how we might organize ourselves socially, in fact, we only occupy a very small part of the range. There is, in essence, one narrow or only one way to be social. And the question is why? And the answer is natural selection. In fact, the key capacities that we humans have that universally characterize our societies and that we need so as to be able to form functional societies are these. We need, first of all, the capacity for identity. We need to be, and I'll explain that in a moment, it's sort of interesting. In order to live socially, we need to be distinctive individuals. Love, friendship, social networks, and the complex mathematical architecture of social ties, cooperation and altruism, in-group preference, the fact that we prefer our own groups to other groups, mild hierarchy, and teaching. And I call these the social suite. These are genetically encoded attributes shaped by natural selection that we express among ourselves, not as isolated individuals. So I'm not interested, for example, in your self-regard. How did natural selection shape your confidence, in your abilities? I'm interested in your other regard. For example, how did natural selection shape your desire to love other people, for example? All of these traits are traits that we express between ourselves, not solely among ourselves. You can't do these things on your own. You have to do them in the company of others. Indeed, natural selection has shaped not just the structure and function of our bodies, and not just the structure and function of our minds, but also the structure and function of our societies. And this is one of the key arguments that I've been trying to make. These traits, therefore, are universal. They are seen in every society. And let's just look at a few of them in the time that we are talking together today. They're discussed in detail in Blueprint. Now, one of the biggest paradoxes, and I mentioned this already, about mammalian social life is that the capacity to be a distinctive individual is actually an essential predicate for living socially. the ability to express and to recognize individuality only evolves when it's beneficial. And when these two capacities are extremely rare in the animal kingdom. Have you ever thought about this? Like, why do all of our faces look different? Why don't we all have the same kind of face? All of our kidneys to do their job should look and function the same, but our faces to do their job should look and function differently. I signal my identity with my face. And not only do I, and that is, it turns out, an evolutionary luxury. It'd be easier for all of us to have the same face. And not only that, but you recognize me as an individual by looking at my face. A large fraction of your brain power is allocated at facial recognition. And so this too is an evolutionary luxury. So we did not evolve these capacities for no reason. If you do not want others to attack you mistakenly, or to forget that they had sex with you, or to provide parental care to a different child and thus neglect you as an infant, or to neglect to repay your kindness, then it is advantageous to have some way to signal, this is me, not someone else, and to have other people recognize that signal. And so such social interactions require that we have the ability to communicate our individuality. And as I said, we use our faces for this purpose, and their unique appearance and our cognitive ability to detect such differences is a rarity and an evolutionary luxury. And this comes about in part because in our faces, unlike other parts of our body, variation in one trait is uncorrelated with variation in another. For example, here on this slide, on the left, these are the dimensions taken from, I don't know, several thousand military conscripts in the United States. And if you measure the length of their hand and the width of their hand on the left-hand panel, as hands get wider, they get longer. The two measurements are correlated. But if you look at people's noses, the width of people's noses and the height of their noses are uncorrelated. Features of our face are not correlated with each other. The distance between our eyes, the distance our ears are set back, the shape of our zygoma, the shape of our mouth, every single feature of our face is uncorrelated with the other features to maximize the diversity of facial structures that is possible. And new research has been revealing the great genotypic variability that underlies facial phenotypes, just like the genotypic variability that's required for optimal functioning of the immune system. You need to have an immune system that's capable of tremendous variety to combat the variety of pathogens that's out there. Now, love is another universal trait. Our species is actually unusual among mammals in that we don't just have sex with our mates, we bond with them. We form a sustained emotional attachment to them. We love them. And love, as you all know, is not essential for mating, but we do it anyway, in part because it helps us to raise our young. And let's see if I can make this work. And even though marriage systems vary tremendously around the world, as shown here, from monogamy to polygyny to polyandry, this fundamental fact of bonding and love does not vary. In every one of these societies and in societies around the world, people love their partners and their children and others. Now, we don't just mate with each other, we also do something else. We befriend each other. Humans are exceedingly unusual as a species in that we form long-term, non-reproductive unions with unrelated individuals. That is, we have friends. Why do we do that? Other animals don't have friendships, with few exceptions I'll come to, but we do. Natural selection has equipped us with the capacity to form long-term, non-reproductive unions with unrelated individuals. And this is seen in every society. And the key attributes of friendship are also quite consistent around the world. These include, for example, mutual aid and our capacity that friends attempt to help each other. Or positive affect, that around the world, that one of the qualities of friendship is you like your friends, you feel good about your friends. Think about all of you have that feeling like when you're in the company of your friends, you feel a warm feeling. Natural selection has endowed you with this capacity. And other traits as well are relatively universal features of friendship. Now, my laboratory has fanned out around the world to study friendship and distinctly to map the social networks that they give rise to. For instance, in one study that was published in Nature about 8 years ago now, we made a photographic census of all living adult Hadza. The Hadza are one of the last remaining groups of hunter-gatherers on the planet. They have no material possessions to speak of. They sleep out under the stars. Every 6 weeks, they relocate their camps. They hunt and they gather for their food. And there are only about 1,000 of them left. And we made a photographic census of all living adult Hadza, like a Hadza Facebook. And we printed it on these posters. And my postdoc, Karen Apicella, took it into the field. And you can't, it's kind of hard to do this because you can't like make an appointment with a Hadza person. You just sort of have to wait till one of them walks by and say, excuse me, could I ask you who your friends are? And she showed them these posters and the people would identify who their friends are. And what we found was that the patterns of friendship and the social interactions and the social networks that they give rise to in the Hadza are just like ours. The mathematical structure of those interactions are indistinguishable from our own. In other words, despite the fact that in the last 10,000 years, we've invented agriculture and cities and telecommunications, the networks we make would appear to be indistinguishable from the networks made by human beings who lived like we did during the Pleistocene. And we've now mapped networks in many parts around the world. Here are some studies that we've done in Honduras and in India and Uganda. And in villages everywhere, we find again and again that the mathematical structure, the topology of these graphs is the same everywhere. Every dot here is a person. Every line between them represents some kind of social relationship, such as friendship between the two people. There is a startling consistency and universality to human social network structure. Very pertinently, however, elephants and dolphins also have friendships. And when other scientists have mapped the social networks of elephants, such as shown on this slide, they look very similar to ours, mathematically speaking. Now, our last known ancestor with an elephant was 85 million years ago. And that ancestor, so far as we know, did not live socially, was a little rodent-like animal. But still, elephants make friends and have networks in ways very similar to ourselves. Natural selection has independently come up with this very uncommon practice. And this is known as convergent evolution, when organisms independently evolve to be similar, solving similar challenges in similar ways. These two cute creatures shared a common ancestor over 200 million years ago that looked nothing like this, and yet they independently evolved in such similar ways in the more recent past. Now, we usually think about this process with respect to physical phenotypes, but it's not limited in this way. And this it could be like in friendship, in the networks we make, which are not physical phenotypes, by convergent evolution could have appeared. And this observation about convergent evolution of friendship and social networks then leads to another paradox. Because to the extent that we resemble animals, like elephants and dolphins and certain other primates, in our propensity for friendship, or other traits that I'll get to, like cooperation, we gain insights into our own common humanity. If we can share the capacity for friendship with elephants, we surely can share it with each other. Now, the actual structure of these networks that we make matters for our life experience. Think about these two objects. As you all learned in high school chemistry, they are both made of carbon. And on the left, you have a graphite, which is soft and dark. You connect the carbon atoms one way, and you get one set of properties. Or you take the same carbon atoms in another allotrope of carbon and connect them another way, and you get diamond on the right, which is hard and clear. And there are two key ideas here. These properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness do not inhere in the carbon atoms, first. And second, these properties are different depending on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. These are emergent properties that arise as a result of how you connect the properties to each other, connect the carbon atoms to each other. Similarly, the pattern of our connections affects the properties of our social groups. It's the ties between people that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. New properties, such as cooperation, can emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. And so it's not just what's happening in the people around you that matters. Our experience of the world also depends on the actual structure of the ties around us, near and far. And these collective social structures that we create, each of us acting atomistically with our neighbors, gives rise to this higher order structure. These collective structures that we make then can have emergent properties, just like the softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are emergent properties of the carbon atoms. And this social order, which we are pre-wired to make, can matter. So this phenomenon of emergence in social systems has other consequences, because it means that the social suite, these 8 properties that I mentioned earlier, has come to be shaped by natural selection in a variety of ways as a result. You see, the idea is that we make these intricate social worlds for ourselves, and these worlds, it turns out, affect us as much as we affect them. Now, one set of ideas regarding the mechanism by which this happens relates to the notion of what I call an exophenotype, whereby genes guide an animal to create things outside its body. So it's the impact of genes, not just on the structure and function of the animal's body or physiology, but the impact of the genes on the structure and function of something outside the animal's body, like beaver dams. A beaver dam is something that an animal innately must make, just like it has to make a tail of a particular kind. And the beaver makes this dam. And when the beaver makes this dam, it will dam a little creek and create a pond with a larger perimeter that the beaver can forage in. Now, the beaver, in reshaping the environment, creates selection pressure for other animals, like little fish swimming in the creek will now be affected by the beaver's damming behavior. But here's the thing. It's not just other animals and plants that are affected by the beaver. The beaver is affected by the beaver. When the beaver builds a dam, it creates a larger pond. So in subsequent generations, beavers with bigger lungs can thrive in environments with bigger dams. And beavers with bigger lungs can make bigger dams. And so you get this feedback loop where the beaver is modifying its environment, and then the environment imposes a selection pressure on the beaver, modifying the beaver's body and behavior. Analogously, humans have evolved to manipulate the social world around us. We don't knit sticks together to make beaver dams. We knit our friends together to make social networks. We modify the social world around us, and this in turn makes certain types of genes more advantageous than others, creating a feedback loop across evolution. Friendly people make friendly worlds, and they do better in friendly worlds. Same with cooperative people. And we make particular kinds of social worlds, and those who can do well in such social worlds grow more numerous, as do their genes. Now, the traits that make up the social suite are mutually supportive. Many of these play roles in the others. I've mentioned how, for example, identity is crucial for love and cooperation. Friendship is crucial for networks and plays a role in cooperation and in in-group preference. Mild hierarchy actually is relevant to our ability to cooperate. Each of these things interacts in some other way with these others. But I'd like, before I close, I'm going to say a few words about the last item on this list, teaching, and then I'll close with some final sort of broader or bigger ideas if I can. Because teaching lies at the root of our capacity for culture. And it's culture, in fact, that is the crucial thing that has allowed us to be the ascendant species on the planet. Now, most animals can learn, like a little fish swimming in the sea can learn that if it swims up to the light, it'll find food there. That's called independent learning, where the animal learns by exploring its own environment. But some animals can learn socially. For example, you put your hand in the fire and you learn independently that fire burns. You've learned something, fire burns, but you've paid a price, you burnt your hand. Or I can watch you put your hand in the fire and I gain almost as much knowledge that fire burns, but I've paid none of the price. Or for example, you and I go into the forest and you eat red berries and die. You've paid an enormous price to acquire the knowledge that red berries are poisonous, but I can watch you eat those red berries and not die. And that kind of social learning, therefore, is phenomenally efficient. And many animals do that too, although many fewer than learn by independent learning. But we don't just learn socially, we do something else. We teach each other things. I teach you to build a fire, or I teach you not to put your hands in the fire. And this is exceedingly rare. Very few animals teach each other things. We do it, certain other primates do it, elephants do it, certain cetacean species do it, and a few other straggler animals. And if you think about it, this teaching is actually a kind of altruism, where we are giving away knowledge to other people. And this ability allows us to cumulatively create and store knowledge and transmit it across time and place. It allows us to be cultural animals, in other words. And the knowledge we transmit across time and space in the form of teaching is a fundamental driver of economic growth and crucial to our survival. For example, in another book I just wrote called Apollo Zero about the pandemic, I talk about how one of the reasons we are able to fight this pandemic is we're taking advantage of decades of scientific advances, where scientists have worked together. We are learning from our ancestors about vaccines and deploying them now to enhance our survival. And it turns out that this capacity for teaching and culture shapes us even more. Our genes affect our capacity for culture, and our culture affects our genes. And this is a further distinct idea from the sort of innate formation of social networks and exophenotypes that I just mentioned. So this sounds similar, but it's actually different. Now, the best example so far of how macro-historical cultural developments could affect our genes is the evolution of lactose tolerance in adults. This is work principally by Sarah Tishkoff and others. What they've done is, many humans alive on the planet today can digest lactose, which is the sugar in milk, as adults using an enzyme called lactase. But why? Why do we have this capacity? Prior to the domestication of milk-producing animals like goats and sheep and cows and camels, no adults were able to digest lactose. Why? Well, because once you were weaned, you never drank milk again for the rest of your life. There was no milk in the environment. But multiple times between 3,000 and 8,000 years ago, human beings domesticated milk-producing animals. They changed their environment, so now there's milk in the environment. And those humans among us who by chance had a mutation which allowed the persistence of lactase into adulthood could do better. There was another source of nutrition available to those people, unavailable to others among them, and a source of hydration and clean water or hydration when the water was spoiled. And those individuals outcompeted each other. Those with lactase persistence outcompeted those with lactase non-persistence and became more numerous as a result of this cultural innovation. So this is an example of something we learn to do using our capacity for teaching and culture that changes the course of our evolution. We are different people with different genes than we would have been had we not invented the domestication of milk-producing animal. So our genes and our culture are in conversation. And there are many amazing examples of this. I think that our invention of cities about 8,000 years ago has changed the nature of our brains, has modified our neurogenomics, that we have different kinds of brains than we would have had we not invented cities. Or, for example, the invention of lenses by medieval lens grinders. People like me who are myopic would have been eaten by lions 10,000 years ago. But now I can survive and pass on my myopic genes, changing the course of evolution. Or climate change. The people that are alive 1,000 or 10,000 years from now are likely to be very different than the people that would have been alive had we not reshaped the global climate. Now, there are a number of applications of these ideas about how we have evolved to make societies. In the introduction, it was mentioned that some of these things that I've been talking about might be useful in thinking about how to organize social institutions and societies. And I discussed that in Blueprint, and that's true. Many firms and other collectivities have found that organizing themselves in a way that's in keeping with our nature is more productive and more effective than trying to organize ourselves in a way that's not in keeping with our nature. But I'm not going to discuss that right now. I'm just going to give one more example of how cultural change might, and then I'll close with one final big idea. I want to give one more example about how cultural innovations might reshape social order, because we've begun increasingly to modify our social systems with different sorts of artificial intelligence. This is a line of work that was inaugurated by another part of my laboratory. This was a paper published in Nature in 2017, and many papers since then using this general thrust, which explores the idea that we are, as humans, increasingly adding machines, such as driverless cars and autonomous agents, such as online bots, to our social systems. And these machines are going to act in human-like ways on a level playing field, as if they were human, in what I call hybrid systems. We are creating hybrid systems of humans and machines, where we have some autonomous agents among us. And this AI might act socially, or might also actually affect our own social organizations. So this AI might change not how we interact with the AI, but the presence of AI might affect how we interact with each other. In one experiment we've done, for instance, on the citation here, we added bots to online groups of humans and showed that how the bots were programmed can make it easier for groups of humans to work together by overcoming friction in their efforts to coordinate their actions. In other words, certain kinds of bots could help the humans to help themselves. And my argument is that hybrid systems will need to respect the social suite if we are to work towards a utopian rather than dystopian future. To the extent that these forms of AI support our innate tendencies as manifested by the social suite, they will be helpful and be seen as helpful. And to the extent that they do not, are inconsistent with the social suite, I think they will be problematic. So let me close with one final idea and then allow time for questions. Our focus on the social origins of goodness also highlights something else. Most human virtues are social and arise from the investment in the lives of others. We do not care very much if you love yourself, or are kind to yourself, or are just to yourself. We care whether you manifest these virtues to other people. Do you love others? Are you kind to others? Are you just to others? Many, not all, but most, I would say, virtues are social in this nature, in this regard. So I'd like to close with a final idea. What accounts for our species' general success in living together in the face of all of our defects and differences? How can we understand the goodness of the social world despite the badness? And in theology, this is known as a question of theodicy, or God's justice. How is God to be justified in the face of all the evil in the world? I believe analogously that we can focus on what I call sociodicy. This is the vindication of our confidence in the virtue of society, despite its numerous failures, so obvious to anyone. And this perspective is in keeping with the Japanese aesthetic philosophy of wabi-sabi, highlighting the flawed beauty of natural and artificial things. So in the Western aesthetic tradition, things that have symmetry or are perfect are seen as beautiful. You know, think about the porcelain made in France, for example, or French topiary in Versailles. But to the Japanese eye and to mine, this pot is beautiful. Or a bonsai tree, which is broken and not symmetrical, is stunningly beautiful. So defective things that are imperfect in some way, are seen in the Japanese aesthetic philosophy of wabi-sabi as actually having a flawed beauty that is magnificent to observe. And I feel similarly about societies. And I don't think this is just idle optimism. Rather, to my eye, it's a recognition of the fundamental good that lies within us. It's very tempting, isn't it, to look at human history as full of abject misery and dysfunction. One can pick any century or millennium and find it replete with horrors. I'm totally aware of this. The violence, the torture, the pogroms, the Inquisition, the colonialism, the slavery, the awful things that we have done to each other and continue to do to each other. I'm well aware of this. This is not some kind of Panglossian argument that we are in the best of all possible worlds. No, that's not the point. The point is that we are magnificent despite these failures. Now, it's true that there was a dramatic inflection for the better that occurred in human societies in the 18th century with the arrival of the Enlightenment and its philosophical values and scientific discoveries, as Steven Pinker and others have argued. Life became longer, richer, freer, and more peaceful. The world is better because of the initial promulgation of these philosophical ideas about equality of human beings and the democratic governance, for instance, which were Enlightenment ideas, by the way. Imperfectly applied, it's taken a couple of hundred years. It's still a work in progress, but there was an inflection in the trajectory of our species due to this historically specific occurrence of the Enlightenment, and due as well to the innovations in chemistry and physics that took place in the 18th and 19th centuries, where we invent the steam engine, we figure out electricity, we figure out combustion and other sorts of things. And these innovations have made our world immeasurably better because of these technological changes. But here's my argument. We do not have to rely solely on such recent historical developments to make the world better. What I've been showing to you today, and then I'll close, is that a more ancient and more powerful and more deep force is at work propelling a good society. In essence, what I'm arguing is that the arc of our evolutionary history is long, but it bends towards goodness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. What an amazing evergreen message that is as relevant today as it ever has been. I'm sure that your talk has inspired a lot of interest, and if you're willing, what we would like to do is let everyone unmute themselves and ask questions as they would for a few minutes until maybe the top of the hour or so. That'll give us 10 or 12 minutes for some additional discussion. So I know I have some questions, but let me see if there's any at this point that would like to respond.
Hi, I have a few questions, if I will.
Go ahead.
And first and foremost, thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting for your work. I had two major questions. First is the idea of group selection within evolutionary theory, which is very much, in essence, discredited. However, as you described, the modularity within human connections, where the connections within a society dictates the outcome as what is being selected for, in essence, as an emergent property, would that not necessitate group selection over the society as a whole, as the societal organization creates emergent properties which can be selected?
So you're right to ask that question. I discuss it at length in the book. I would not use the term group selection, which has become very provocative, but I would talk about multi-level selection. Our work does not prove or disprove arguments about group selection in human beings, but we are amassing evidence in my laboratory about the role of natural selection in shaping these social properties in individuals. And I don't have time to go into it right now, but if you take a group of people, if you have 100 people and 500 ties, so each, this is your budget, 100 people, 500 ties, you should have the intuition that you can arrange those 500 ties into different topologies, different network architectures. And some of those architectures, it turns out, might be quite conducive to the spread of germs, and other structures would be not conducive to the spread of germs. And lo and behold, the kind of structure we make is a kind of collective immune system which retards the spread of germs. And we do it, though, at the individual level. In other words, by having a certain set of traits related to friendship, we form ourselves into groups that reduce our proclivity to getting infected. So you can make the argument without having to resort to strict group selection, where you have the whole problem of what's the unit of selection and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
I see one
I
hand
have
raised.
a question.
I see one hand raised by someone by the name of Abdel Holloway.
I think
Hi,
Adele
yeah,
just asked.
once again, thanks for the talk. I have a question concerning your 8 dimensions that you showed. I get thinking about how we can categorize, like human systems and human societies. You can create, I don't know how to say this, but like, for example, with the snail example, you have the 3 dimensions and you can classify the shells according to those 3 dimensions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the 3 dimensions explain, because those 3 dimensions could explain 70, 80, 90, it can be very variable. You don't know how many dimensions. So I guess, how do you know that those 8 dimensions of, identity and such are complete? Or do you think there are extra dimensions that can explain human behavior,
Yes.
human social behavior in a later context?
So there are 2 aspects to your question. First is actually 3 aspects. The first 2 are methodologic aspects, and it turns out even with the shell example, there was a huge debate in zoology and paleontology. Someone else said actually Raupp's 3 dimensions were not fully independent. There was some dependency among them, which reduced the space. Also, he didn't account for hinges, shells that have hinges in them. How do you get the hinge? And didn't account for the unfolding of the shells. Someone else said, no, it's 11 dimensions, and they promulgated another model. It's a mathematical model. It's a simplification. And in my case, I'm using it as a kind of metaphor for what I'm talking about. Now, you're right. There could be some other 9th, 10th thing that is relevant to social order that I haven't included, but I'd invite you to suggest what it would be. You see, the crucial thing is it can't be things like religion or risk aversion or things that you can practice on your own. So what I'm trying to include on that list is things that relate to how we interact with each other, things that are collective properties of groups. And yes, I mean, there could be something else. I'm not saying there isn't, but I am advancing the argument that those 8 are important, and they help to provide an account for a social order that is effective and sound. In the last chapter of the book, I engaged the philosophical and moral question of what is good. Why would I say these things are good? And how do I avoid the naturalistic fallacy? And here I make use of some wonderful work by moral philosopher Philippa Foot, which again, I don't have time to go into right now. I just gave you a short introduction to the what is a big topic and 20 years of work in my laboratory.
Thank
Did I
you for
answer
the
your question? Was it good
Yeah.
enough? It was?
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm not a sociologist, so I, just hearing is so interesting. So thank you.
Nicholas in the chat, Sophia asks, why is identity crucial for cooperation?
Because you have to remember who's who. If you want to do a tit for tat exchange, for instance, which is the simplest exchange, I give you a favor and I do it in expectation that you will give me a favor in the future. You need to remember who I am that did a favor, and I have to remember that you owe me a favor. Otherwise, I could do you a favor and you might return the favor to someone else. Now, it actually turns out in some experiments we've done in my lab, that kind of pay it forward cooperation is very important too. But just for starting conditions, identity is crucial for cooperation. If you were interacting, or another example would be if you were interacting with strangers, you're going to be much less kind to strangers than to known individuals. What does it mean to be known? It means you can know, you can identify each individual. They have some kind of unique identity that you track.
Thank you. And I think Dave Dorman, you've unmuted yourself, so please ask your question.
Yes, along with all the elements that you mentioned, there's also things that we think of as less positive, like jealousy, drive to power, revenge. Do you think a case could be made that every so-called good has necessitates a bad, and that they really go together, and all of them are critical for how we evolve and how society has evolved?
So I'm not sure that hatred is required for a good society. It might be, actually. We're doing some work in my lab right now exploring why we have the capacity to track our enemies. In other words, why don't we divide the group into the world into friends and strangers? Why do we have the cognitive capacity to have friends, strangers, and enemies? There maybe we theorize there might be some benefit to this capacity. Now, I would, in a way, so first point. Second point, you could say that each of these traits has its opposite, but of course, not all things that are opposite. Like some people would say that happiness and unhappiness are not opposite, that you can have, that they're not fully, they're not orthogonal either. There's like a slight angle between the two. They're not 180 degrees, they're like this. And so we could engage in a conversation, you and I, well, if they truly are opposite, then I don't need to grant you what you're asking for. I can just say, well, there's love and it's opposite, and I'm on one end of a unipolar, kind of spectrum, for example. So I would say to you that things like jealousy and lying and violence are not required for a good society. And furthermore, I would say, as I hinted at the beginning, that these good qualities that we have overall are more powerful than the bad qualities, for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning, and which actually I think I explore at length in the book. I'll give a longer explanation in the book. I don't mean to keep saying to so many of you, check out the book. It's just that it's hard to make, these are complicated with lots of data and lots of ideas, and they're subtle. And so there aren't easy answers to these things.
We're going to take three more questions, and let me call on Liz and then Diane, and then I have a question in the chat.
Thank you. I wondered if the in-group preference was something that kind of throws a wrench in the works for a good society.
Well, that's, as you can see, that you and I both agree that it's really awful. It depresses the hell out of me that we have in-group preference, but we do. And it is part of, it is necessary, I think, in some ways for the functioning of a good society. So you're right, and I blew by that in the talk, of all the things, yeah, exactly, as I said, love and friendship and cooperation and teaching and group preference.
Yeah. So why do we need that? Why do we need that?
Well, there's a set of ideas in the book as to why. And actually, there's also a set of ideas from cognitive neuroscience as to why we even have the capacity to divide the world into us versus them. There's a whole Hegelian dichotomy set of ideas, and about how, why we think of night and day and land and sea, and we have all these distinctions, male and female. We have all these dichotomies that we divide up the world into, and that it's a cognitive heuristic. And so us and them might partake of that we have this capacity, and it turns out that this ability to distinguish us versus them may have played a crucial role in the evolution of cooperation. And I could actually say a lot more about that, but because there are a couple more questions, again, I don't mean to keep saying, it's discussed at length in the book, and I think I give
read the book, I promise.
You don't have to, but I promise that I give an adequate explanation with tons of citations to explain that. But the gist is that drawing boundaries, well, maybe I'll just tell you a quick idea. Let's just say, here's a kind of toy model. Imagine you had 1,000 people, and I told each of those people, be nice to everyone, cooperate with everyone. Well, it would be very difficult for you to track those 1,000 people. Maybe you'd be nice to one person, you would never see the other person again. And so the overall level of cooperation in those 1,000 people might be 0.
It's a way to constrain resources. It's a way to constrain resources.
Well, it's cognitive resources and other things, but here's the gist. Now imagine I take the same 1,000 people in the same environment, so same total resources in the environment, and I give them each 100 of them a flag, a purple flag, a green flag, whatever. And now I tell each person, just be nice to the people with your color flag. Now, everyone, it's a simpler problem. You only have to be nice to 100 people. You might bump into that again. And so now you might see that cooperation can evolve and arise in the species or in this population because we've allowed the group to be partitioned to smaller groups that are distinct. So there are very deep arguments about the coevolution of the emergence of cooperation and this capacity for in-group bias. And they're discussed at length in the book, but that's the gist of one idea.
Thank you.
I think, Ted, do you have a follow-up question?
Well, I don't know if I should break into the list of questioners, but you mentioned Philippa Foot in passing, and her most famous thing is it's a rather mysterious thing. She said it's useful when we're talking about morality to think about plants.
Yes,
of course, we all ought to be thinking about plants. And how does your notion about all of these improvements of a movement toward a greater society help us to deal with the collapse of the planet's ecosystems? And do we see a way to connect these ideas that you say are genetically inherited with a new challenge, which doesn't really have a genetic background, as it were? We have to start anew to create an ethic and a morality and a sense of obligation toward the world of plants and things far outside of the range of humans.
So Ted, I'm going to evade your question and not engage in a conversation about biophilia, the notion that we should love and care for the natural world, or that children thrive in the natural world. There's enormous literature on that. Or the issues of climate change and what duty do we have to preserve the natural world for subsequent generations, all of which are important. And I suspect you and I have very similar views on that. And instead, I'm just going to narrowly address the Philippa Foot line. Professor Foot was widely known also for her work on the trolley problem, yes, and a very famous example of spelunkers, which I won't go into right now. But the line that Ted recognized that's in the book is a magnificent opening to one of her short books. And it goes like this: in moral philosophy, I think it is helpful to think about plants. And you're like, what the hell is this woman talking about? Why would we be useful to think about plants? And she goes on an extended metaphor about roots. What does it mean to speak about the good roots? That when you think about plants, you can say these roots are good. And they are good because they help the plant be a plant. And this is her entree into a set of arguments about how we can provide a naturalistic account of the emergence of goodness or goodness without appeal to a God, without appeal to voting and majoritarian ideas. How can we say that something is good? For example, a clock is good when it tells time correctly. It's fulfilling its mission in a way. Roots are good when they support the plant and provide water and so on. And it's in that sense that I'm speaking of a good society. That society is good, which allows us to thrive and be fully human, is the essence. So I'm borrowing her ideas to advance that, and other moral philosophers' ideas from the post-war period.
We've sneaked past the top of the hour, but Diane, I think you had your hand raised. Did you get your question answered, or did you still have one?
I didn't, although I think it is related to Liz's question about in-group preference. And in particular, it was very nice listening to this talk and thinking about the positive aspects of society in a time when sort of tribalism and divisiveness seems all in the news. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on what's gone wrong.
Well, I have a lot to say about that. I talk a little bit about that in the last chapter of the book. I also have a short essay in Time magazine that you can find online that addresses some potential political implications of what these ideas might mean. But let me just give you one short digression, which I think will answer 80% of your question. So you're right to highlight the fact that our in-group preference and our tribalism right now have the better of us. But evolution has endowed us with two other qualities, which are also part of the social suite, that allow us to get out of the tribalistic trap. One quality, so imagine you have a population like our country, and we're divided in tribal groups. How do we stop that? Well, one ability is to go up a level and to say we're all American, for example. Or this is the trope in science fiction movies where we're all fighting among ourselves and the aliens invade. And we're like, oh, we're all human, let's fight the aliens, okay? And so this is, we can use our ability to recast the social world around us and to draw new dichotomies and say we're all American. And this is a fundamental feature of American society. De Tocqueville writes about this. A pluribus unum, Americans are joiners. There's something to being an American. You just believe in the Bill of Rights and anyone can become an American. Our society is, for all of its failings, is amazing in this regard, politically speaking now. So that's one solution to tribalism, is to go up a level, and it's been a part of our politics and our history. The other solution, however, is to go down a level to the level of individuals, where we now start seeing every person as a unique individual. And as I discussed today, we all have that capacity to recognize each individual and to transcend their group membership. I don't care what group you're in. You are you. You're Diane Beck with your particular life history and your particular traits and abilities and weaknesses and all of the stuff that goes into each of us. And this too has been a part of our tradition. If you think about Martin Luther King's famous remark, I look forward to a time when my children are judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. This is what he's saying. He's saying we should all look at each other as individuals, not as member of groups. So in answer to your question, what I would say is that some of these ideas that I've discussed today are relevant, not only to the emergence of the problem of tribalism, but also to its solution.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's worthwhile taking one question. There's a couple in the chat, but I know we're running out of time, but there's one, Gabrielle Alfaro, who actually teaches his class from your book. Gabrielle, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and asking a question, or I can read it, it doesn't matter, but maybe you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yes. So I had a question regarding the factor, the issue of emotions, and the impact that some of your work. Have you ever looked into how emotions affect some of the scholarship that you're producing with respect to sociality?
You mean my own emotions?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I've come to find is that when I was a younger man, I greatly admired older men and women, but mostly I was looking at the men as models, who were very reserved, who would really contain their emotions. And I thought this was a really magnificent ability. And I trained in karate, and I did all these things to try to be able to regulate my emotions. But as I got older, although I'm better able now to regulate my emotions than when I was younger, I came less and less to see, I saw this as like, I am just more emotional than the average person. And whether it's my Greek heritage, or my wife says it's nothing to do with my Greekness, it's just that, I'm Nicholas. So, and I'm no longer afraid or bothered by my emotional intensity. So I do bring that to my work. I absolutely care deeply about these topics. And I also I try to bring a sense of wonder and awe to the work that we do in my lab, kind of a respect for the natural world. You can have the same respect if you're a physicist or an engineer or an art historian. I'm not saying it's unique to what we do studying people, but there is a kind of an emotional connection to the work. I care about these things, and I care about improving the healthcare system. I care about reducing racial inequality. I care about redressing economic adversity in our society. I care about public health and so on. Now, on the issue of the emergence of emotions, the evolution of emotions, we also have explored this. Ask yourself this question. When human beings have emotions, we show them. Why? Why do we show our emotions? It's not hard to provide an account from evolutionary biology as to why it would increase our Darwinian fitness to have emotions. For example, to feel happiness or anger or disgust or fear, to have those feelings. But we don't just have those feelings, we show them. And I not only show them, but you can read them. And you not only read my emotion, but you copy it. You see, emotional contagion is itself a deep and fundamental aspect of emotional experience. We evolved, I think, to have emotions and to copy each other's emotions. And so they are extremely important. The reason I don't include them and other things like religion and other traits in the social suite is that you can have emotions on your own, right? You could love yourself too, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in interpersonal love or friendship, So emotions are something you can do on your own. And what I'm really interested in is those traits which require the presence of other people. I kind of meandered around, but perhaps I gave an adequate answer to your question.
No, I mean, just really quickly, I mean, in a way, the in-group, the comments about the in-group, yeah, it may seem depressing, but, maybe perhaps we're kind of leaning or we're gravitating towards a global in-group. Maybe that will bring us together.
Many people have made this argument that we are slowly, and I would say it would be over eons, tens of thousands of years before we had a progressive, increase. But possibly. However, you might not like that world because we might evolve to be like naked mole rats or like ants. Literally, there might be like workers and nurse, and only one person, one ant reproduces, and so on. So I'm not sure we would like that world, but yes, we could be evolving in that direction.
Thanks, Professor Christakis.
Thank you.
I have missed one important question in the chat. I promise this will be the last one. Elida asks a very timely and important question, and she speaks to the benefit of social systems, and she asks, how do you reconcile the benefits of social systems with the massive social injustices that are simultaneously happening during that era, during the era of enlightenment?
Well, I mean, the injustices were worse before the Enlightenment and preceded it. I mean, for example, take the situation of slavery. Humans had enslaved each other in every part of the world for thousands of years. And yet with the Enlightenment, first beginning actually in England and then spreading to Europe and around the world, you get an anti-slavery movement. I want to be very clear. I'm not sweeping under the carpet the horrors that are present today or were present a century or 2 centuries ago or have been present forever. That's not my project. What I am trying to say, however, is that there is a fundamental goodness to human beings that counterbalances the badness and that has been shaped by natural selection and that we can draw on to try to make a better world.
Thank you so much for spending a few extra minutes with the group that's still large in numbers, and I know they wanted to stay until the end, and we appreciate the time that you've given to us today, Nicholas.
Thank you so much for having me, for this terrific honor of giving this lecture, and for allowing me to join you even remotely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining this year's Beckman-Brown Lecture.